Okay. Ooh, that's so loud. All right. Okay, there we go. I know I'm 1 minute late. How many complaints about no stream today? None. Okay, I'm doing okay. Wow, welcome back once again to SOC 377. So today, we've been talking about families here for a little bit. We got through kind of Rigneris's argument about changes in what people are looking for in terms of marriage, in the future of Christian marriage, where he talks about things like capstone marriage and what's changed, right? And specifically, what's changed for women, largely looking for increased stability, right? And in partners, they're changing their romantic evaluation of partners, largely around resources and what they're able to bring. Can they sustain lifestyles? And men becoming less willing to marry in general, as what they're looking for in relationships, at least in part, in terms of sex, is more available at a lower cost to them as well, right? And then we started talking about this kind of interesting piece from Johann Kurtz, where he, is going to make a case that, declining family size and fertility is related to something, but not what we typically think, right? And he says, we typically think it's one of these 5 things. A rise in economic instability, challenges getting housing, declines in religiosity, increased access to contraception, and lack of childcare. But he's going to make the case that it's actually something else, and here he says it's actually about status, right? The status conferred by having children has fundamentally changed. So, in a sense, he's making an argument about culture rather than about necessarily other structural forces, which I do think is really interesting. We talked very briefly, or at the end of last class, maybe not very briefly, I don't remember, about some of these interventions and why he doesn't think economics sort of is a good explanation for declining fertility rates. Specifically, that economic interventions haven't, as of yet, right? We don't have any real examples of economic interventions or offering, tax breaks or cash or family allowances having really increased fertility, right? And we talked about Hungary last time. Hungary spends 5% of its GDP on fertility drives of some type in all sorts of forms. They've tried cash, they've tried housing, they've tried tax breaks. Other places have tried all sorts of things as well. Poland has a very generous family allowance system that has monthly payments, per child under 18, that, has had no effect, but certainly hasn't driven Polish fertility back anywhere close to replacement fertility. I'm trying to think. I mean, Russia historically has had a bunch of weird schemes as well, from cash to, in the 90s when things were really bad, it was like, well, we'll give you a refrigerator if you have a child. That didn't work either, right? And yeah, even countries with some of the most generous family benefits around, right, our Scandinavian countries with their really powerful welfare states have some of the lowest fertility rates on Earth. Okay, so religiosity. Do I have housing? Oh, housing's next. Okay, I have them out of order. Religiosity. So the tendency has been to think that one of the reasons that fertility has declined is an overall societal decline in religiosity, right? That basically, as people have grown less religious, that has led to them having fewer children. That there's some kind of inherent link between being religious and having a lot of kids. And I understand where this sort of instinct comes from, right? Because we do have, some groups, the Amish, being one of them, traditional Catholics. I don't know if you're in my other class, SOC of religion, but I talk sometimes about my friend Jared. Jared is a very Catholic guy, and he has 11 kids. So that's a lot, right? I think probably 3 seems like a lot to me some days. So I can't imagine 11. And then, groups like Mormons. Mormons aren't, crazy. They're at an average of somewhere around, 3 children per woman to, around 2.6 on average, but way above the kind of, average for the societies they live in. So, and these are typically pretty religious groups. And so we think, being religious probably equals high fertility. The problem is, outside of these few little enclaves, right? The Amish, traditional Catholics, Mormons, even the most religious people we find outside of these groups barely hit replacement fertility, right? So if we look at, say, evangelicals, right? So we tend to think of evangelical Protestants as very religious, and there's lots of good reasons to think they are. In terms of the sociology of religion data, evangelical Christians are weird, right? They have a lot of really weird markers, and amongst them, they're very religious. They barely hit replacement fertility, right? So they're just above 2.1 children per woman. So they're not exactly knocking things out of the park. A little bit better than the societal average, but not anything crazy. And if we look at, say, the 3 most religious countries in Europe, Romania, Moldova, and Greece, all of them have negative population growth, right? They look like a lot of other developed Western European countries in that they're, they have fertilities ranging from 1.3 to about 1.5-ish, maybe 1.56 children per woman. So being a super religious country, or a country where everybody, says, or not everybody, but large majorities say religion is very important to them, doesn't really seem to drive fertility. So could it be something else? Is the final written online just like the midterms? What a pertinent question to the topic. Yes, it is. I don't mean to make fun of you, but I'm making fun of you just a little. Does that bring the comment back? It does. I could have done that last class because I deleted a comment. Okay. So housing. Okay. This is a kind of constant complaint and something that you do hear bandied about a lot by policy makers. And generally the equation is something like this. People want to own their house before having children. So the more we delay home ownership, the lower fertility you're going to get, because you're going to push that back. Excuse me. You're going to push that back so far that people are going to not be able to own their own homes and therefore aren't going to start families. Now, there's a lot of reasons to think that this isn't true. I actually think that the evidence that Kurt cites is not particularly compelling, right? He talks about, how millennials' share of home ownership, millennials have started to do really well. We talked about that at the beginning of the course, right? Millennials are, in general, doing quite well economically. And so, they've caught up largely to the boomers. Millennials' fertility rate is low and has remained low even as their home ownership rate has declined or has increased, right? So buying their homes didn't cause them to have a bunch of children. Now, it may be, other reasons for this that I think Kurtz isn't considering, right? That now you've pushed that so late in the fertility window that it's really hard to have children, right? And you've made things more difficult. However, I will say that if you look at some of the other evidence, and even if you look at countries with particularly high home ownership rates, even for relatively young people, it doesn't track with increased fertility. And here, Russia is a really interesting example because Russia has a really high home ownership rate. Now, it depends on what statistics you look at. Official Russian government statistics put the home ownership rate at 80% of Russians owning their own home. There's reasons to doubt state Russian kind of statistics for lots of reasons, right? Everything is better in Novosibirsk than it is everywhere else. But probably a pretty reasonable estimate is that at least 70% of Russians own their own home, and home ownership, is relatively in reach for lots of people because of a much different kind of economic system. Now, that said, Russia's fertility remains really low. I mean, it's quite low right now because of the, ongoing war now entering its 5th year. But even prior to the war, right, Russia's fertility was sitting probably somewhere around 1.7 children per woman, which is higher than a lot of Western European nations, but still well below fertility. So home ownership and the availability of homes doesn't seem to track one-to-one with higher fertility, right? There's obviously other things going on. Okay. Oops. Sorry, just seeing if people have questions. All right, now contraception, because this is the easy one to sort of believe, right? Well, it's birth control, right? Birth control is the cause of declining fertility. Now, certainly, the availability, the simplicity of birth control, definitely plays a role. However, it's likely not the entire story. And here, very specifically, I want to zoom, but I still can't. And one day I will figure this out. Oh, here it is, my magnifying glass. Wait, it disappeared. Come back, magnifying glass. I don't know what I did to deserve the magnifying glass going away. Okay, I want to zoom on this chart, but I can't. Okay, I'll just kind of tell you what's going on here because I can kind of see the dates. The point that Kurtz makes is that fertility in the West, in particular, has actually been dropping for a really, really long time, right? And that actually the declines in fertility long precede the invention of contraception, right? That actually contraception is not likely the thing driving it at the end of the day. Oh, I'm so mad. I just want to zoom. Why won't you? It's because there's writing on the slide. I bet you if I erase the writing, it'll come back. All right, we're just gonna wait. Maybe not. Why don't you like me, slides? Sometimes you like me. I have never figured this out, and I can't make it work consistently. Okay, what do we see here, right? So if we look, 1890, right? So 1890 is about 70 years prior to the advent of artificial contraception. And what do we see from the period 1890 till about 1940 is a steady decline, and this is in fertility in the TFR in the United Kingdom, a really steady decline in total fertility in the UK in that period, right? So before birth control ever becomes a thing, you have a decline in fertility. You get this bump, which tricks us all into thinking that, even in the recent past, without contraception, people had a lot of kids. That's your baby boomers, right? That's that big demographic explosion of the baby boom, after which it kind of settles back down and keeps going down in the way it was prior to the baby boom, right? So the baby boom, if we take, the baby boomers and their births out of the equation, what we really have is a long pattern of declining fertility in the West that started a long time ago and started before contraception, right? And this is our gross fertility rate. This is a slightly different measure. When we talk gross fertility, we're talking about typically births per 100,000, or 1,000. How many births per 1,000? I believe births per woman for every 1,000 women, right? And what we see, if we look historically, French fertility, right, started to drop way earlier, right? It actually dropped in the 18th century, and by the beginning of the 19th century, it was particularly low and has stayed low ever since, right? Into the beginning of the 20th century, at which point it's going to drop even further. British and Welsh fertility took a longer time. We've clearly had declines in fertility not related to contraception, right? So contraception can't be the whole story, because actually when we look at it in context, Western fertility has been dropping for a very, very long time. So it has to be driven by something else. Okay, and what Kurt suggests, right, is that we have a different fundamental cause. And he says this is status, which manifests differently in different places as different proximate causes, right? Okay, so what does he mean by status, right? By status, he means, it's a nice sociological definition for us, the perceived standing of the individual within the group, right? So, your status denotes your place within the formal and informal hierarchies of which you are part. And this is really normal for humans, right? Gaining status, right, is a motivation for each individual to participate in society productively. Like, we all want to increase our status to some extent, right? You want to be the smartest, the coolest, the best, right? Or slightly better than the person next to you, even if you're not the best. You want to move up in status. And there's a whole bunch of different ways of doing this. We'll talk about that. Historically, societies have had different ways of assigning status. And what Kurtz points to is that fundamentally, one of the things that happened in Western culture is that, we shifted where you used to have a net status from having children, right? Especially for women, being a mother used to offer status, and he thinks it doesn't anymore, right? He thinks that the net outcome of having a child is lower than the status outcomes for other competing undertakings, right? And everything in life is a balance, right? You can only do so many things. So at the end of the day, if something gives you more status than having a child, you're likely to go in that direction. And he says things like pursuing a successful career, or education, or whatever it happens to be, right, grants more status to people. So they do that rather than having children, right? Okay, and how is status gained, right? Through approved behaviors, achievements, etiquette, defending the group, and through possessions, or the possession of recognized status symbols, titles, wealth, important physical assets, right? Things like that. What his argument here is that because having children confers less kind of status points, if you will, than other things, having children has been deprioritized, kind of without people really thinking about it, right? People react to the status symbols and the status hierarchies in their societies on an almost unconscious level. And they follow these kinds of life and social scripts that are laid out for them to gain those levels of social status. Okay. So, he says this. This is his, I guess if you were to say, his, let me get my pen back. Proposition 1. Right, so this is the argument he's making. So if you're doing a debate, this is Proposition 1. If the pursuit of status was the primary causal factor in suppressing fertility, what we should expect to see are the 6 following things. Number one, interventions that increase the status of parents will also increase fertility. Communities where you have where parents are higher status should have higher fertility. High status individuals who become parents should cause other people to follow suit. Social strivers, so people who are not status secure but are actually trying to climb social hierarchies, are more likely to forego children for higher status objectives, right? So each of these is an argument. Our status secure people, our established elites, should have higher fertility, and groups with weird status systems will have unusual fertility patterns. And I mean, I think we can already check number 6 off the list with our traditional Catholics, Amish and Mormons, right? They all have unusual status systems where, say for traditional Catholics, adherence to church teaching, even if it lands you with 11 kids, right, is the status that you care about. So, you'll see unusual fertility patterns in those groups. Okay, I love this part. This is like one of my favorite things. My actually whole reason for including this in the course is like these two arguments, because I think they're really neat and really interesting. The case of, so status and fertility, the case of Georgia. And here, Georgia, we are talking about the small country in the Caucasus, right, just south of Russia, not the American state where they build Hondas and Toyotas. And they probably grow peaches, I think. Georgia peaches are a thing. Not that Georgia. The other Georgia. Okay, so in the mid-2000s, Georgia spiked its birth rate, right? It increased by a whopping 28%. Now, Georgia, I talked about Hungary last time. Georgia and Hungary, in some ways, share really interesting parallels. They're both really small countries. I want to say that the population of Georgia is around somewhere between 4 and 5 million, right? So it's a very, very small country. And it's a very unique culture. It's very different. Its language is quite different. It has a really long religious tradition in the Georgian Orthodox Church. It's really unique. It's also, faced demographic declines. And for small countries, demographic declines, and especially ethnically bound small countries, demographic declines become a really, really big problem, because it means the extinction of Georgians, right? Within a few generations, right? Maybe 4 or 5 generations, you would basically have Georgians disappearing. So what happened in the mid-2000s is they actually managed to reach and surpass replacement fertility. Now, it's come down a bit since then. It sits just below replacement fertility today, but still relatively high, given its status as a developed, industrialized, urbanized country. Okay, so the cause, and this is pretty universally recognized, because it has that systemic ordering, is the patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church. And this is, the head, like basically think the Pope of the Georgian Orthodox Church. Is not an exact parallel, because the Orthodox, the patriarchs aren't popes, but whatever, let's just pretend, announced that he would baptize and become the godfather to all third children and onward. Okay, so when you had your third child and every subsequent child after that, they got baptized by Ilya II, right? Who's a very prominent figure, kind of a celebrity in Georgia. He would baptize and be the godfather to your kids, right? So he would show up, he would do the baptism and, act as the godfather to your children. Okay, so births of third children boomed. Now, I think really importantly, it's not that everybody had a third, like every couple had, a second and a third child. You actually, in order to increase fertility pretty substantially, you don't actually need that many, couples to have a third child in this case, right? But what you actually need to do is just kind of increase the aggregate, right? So a few more people have to be moved from 0 to 1. A few more people have to be moved from 1 to 2. a few more people have to be moved from 2 to 3, and so on, right? So if you can move enough people into slightly higher fertility categories, you increase total fertility rate pretty substantially. And in this case, yeah, lots of people started having third and more children. Now, this has been widely understood as a religious phenomenon, people reacting to the command of a religious leader, right? Excuse me, to have more children. What Kurt says, and I think he's right here, is that this is actually a status phenomenon, right? Ilya is a celebrity. If he is the godfather of your child, you are connected to a celebrity, right? And I always kind of think of the example here, for people in Edmonton, is what if, because Connor McDavid suddenly became really, really interested in Edmonton's total fertility rate. If Connor McDavid, totally plausible, I think this is right up his alley. He's not worried about winning a Stanley Cup or a gold medal, just about total fertility rates. But he says, I will, become the godfather to every third child and beyond in the city of Edmonton, right? That would move at least some people who want to, have Connor be able to be like, oh, do you see little Johnny? Well, do you know who little Johnny's godfather is? It's Connor McDavid, right? It would move some people into that category of having a third child, right? Again, not everybody's going to be motivated to have a third child based on this. Some people won't. Some people will have, 2 kids with the intention of having a third and be like, nah, I think we're good. Who cares about that whole thing? But, it connects you with a celebrity and it moves some people there because it raises your status, right? People also emulate celebrities, right? When celebrities do things, often people will follow. Okay, so that's the case of Georgia. Mongolia. So Mongolia is another one of these really, really interesting cases. And again, Mongolia is a weird country. It's oddly geographically and culturally cut off in some ways, right? It's very, it's stuck kind of between, Russian Siberia and the kind of north central part of China. But again, a relatively small country in terms of population, relatively homogenous, unique language, unique culture, one that hasn't been overly affected by Western culture either, because it was kind of under the Soviet thumb for that 70-year period during, communism. And again, Mongolia had been facing some fertility challenges. And again, they responded in a really, really unique way. And what's happened is fertility in Mongolia has consistently been somewhere between 2 and 3 times higher than its neighbors, right? You see, like this is a few years ago, so this number isn't accurate today. It's a little bit lower, but you see like other, the parts of China that it's kind of surrounded by, right? And then places like North Korea at 1.97, probably a lie, by the way. South Korea, which at this point was 1.17, today South Korea, depends on whose numbers you look at, but it's between 0.063 and, or 0.63 and I've seen as high as 0.83. Really, really low. South Korean fertility is really, really low. So that number is not accurate, right? But Mongolia has maintained above replacement fertility for quite a long time. And it's not because it's a super religious country. It's not, right? It's not Christian or Muslim. It's Buddhist. And the form of Buddhism it practices isn't particularly, like it's, culturally appropriate, but it's not like a form of Buddhism that says have 22 babies or anything like that. I don't know of a form of Buddhism that says that. It's just, and it's an urbanized country, right? It's industrialized. It's like a lot of its neighbors. And yeah, a lot of non-religious folks. But what the difference seems to be is that women who have 4 children at the birth of your 4th child, you are given by the president of Mongolia, right? So this happens every year. The president of Mongolia tours around Mongolia And in Mongolia's major cities, there's always like, it's kind of like a city hall. It's this big, concrete building in the kind of brutalist Soviet style. Almost inevitably, and in every picture I've ever seen, there's a statue of Genghis Khan outside of it, right? Because Mongolians, and Genghis Khan is still a touch point for Mongolians apparently. So right, you've got your statue of Genghis Khan, and the president gets together all the women from this region, and he gives them an award, which I love the name of this, the Order of Maternal Glory, right? So you receive an award called the Order of Maternal Glory and $60, right? And it's important. There is a financial incentive that goes along with the award. You also get $60 in local currency, right? So it's worth a little bit more than it would be here, but the equivalent of US $60, right? It's not a huge motivator. Even in Mongolia, $60 isn't going to buy you much. But this seems to have helped keep Mongolia's total fertility rate relatively high and well above replacement fertility, especially compared to the neighborhood it lives in, right? And what is this? This is a status thing, right? Now, again, I think what's interesting about these examples is I think they're non-exportable. Mongolia, very small, very ethnically homogenous. Georgia, very small, very ethnically homogenous, right? Both of them are somewhat isolated in some senses. Mongolia is very isolated. It's just in the middle of Central Asia in the middle of East Asia, between Siberia and northern China, right? Not the easiest place to get to. I think you have to either go through China or you have to go to Vladivostok in Russia. I guess you can fly into Ulaanbaatar, but whatever. Right, they're small, relatively isolated countries. A country like Canada, something like this probably doesn't work because we're much more diverse and bigger. And I don't think Mark Carney flying around to a town hall that has a statue of Gordie Howe outside of it, offering the Order of Maternal Glory, is going to work in Canada. But it has worked in these countries, and it is a form of status raising. I do want to see Mark Carney try that. I think it would be funny. Just because, no reason. I don't think it would work, but it would be hilarious. Okay, so the opposite, right? South Korea. In South Korea, a good percentage of the really high status people are childless, right? And as I mentioned last time, or maybe not last time, I don't remember. I know I said it in this class. I just can't remember when. South Korea's total fertility rate has been dropping, and today South Korea finds itself in a low fertility trap, right? Where there's not enough young women in kind of the years where they can have children to have enough children to really boost total fertility, and they don't want to have children either because culturally that's not what's been held up as valuable in South Korea, and we'll see why in a sec. Basically, it's super expensive and super difficult in South Korea to get ahead, and so people just don't have kids because they have to make choices, right? They have to balance things. But yeah, most of the really high status people in South Korea are childless. Lots of high status people in the U.S. are also childless. I mean, so far. Right? Taylor Swift, still childless, I believe, unless something's changed. Has something changed? Nothing's changed. Good. I don't have to change this slide. I heard Katy Perry's now pregnant with Justin Trudeau's baby, so I don't know. Maybe that was just someone trolling me on Twitter. I don't know. I hope that's not true. But it could be now. People are Googling it, right? But I don't think Katy Perry's particularly high status anymore. Her best days as a star are behind her. Lots of the European elites, specifically right now, Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz, the former German chancellor, also childless. So lots of really high status people increasingly are childless. So we do see that. Okay. Social strivers, right? So as opposed to the status secure, right? People who are trying to increase their status, there are sort of trade-offs that have to be made to increase your status. Like, you can't do everything. So if your goal, and a lot of this is unconscious, is to increase your social status, right? You're going to choose those activities that are, excuse me, going to increase your status the most. Okay, so here, demand for education, especially at elite institutions, is at an all-time high. Now, this is probably truer of, say, you know, like the UK or the United States, right? Especially the US. We don't quite have anything equivalent in Canada, right? Where they've got that Ivy League system, right? Where you've got Harvard, you know, Princeton, Brown, Yale, and I think UPenn. I want to say there might be other Ivy League schools, but I can't remember them off the top of my head. Right, where going to those schools automatically confers you the status of an elite, right? You went to Yale, you went to Harvard, right? You know, the old joke. I had a friend who went to Yale, and you know, his joke was, how can you tell if someone's gone to Yale? You don't have to; they'll tell you, right? Yeah, and if you've ever met anyone who went to Yale, like, they can't shut up about it. When I was at Yale, I was like, oh, okay, super fun. Can we talk about something else? You know, I love the Temple Bar stories, but whatever, no one cares. This is an all-time high, right? As people strive for higher social status, you know, people want to get their kids into not just college, but an Ivy League college in the States. In the UK, you have a similar system in places like Oxford, Cambridge, right? LSE, and similar kinds of really, really elite schools. I don't think we quite have the same thing in Canada, right? A university education is treated as pretty equivalent, right? I know I have my one friend, Sean, and he went to University of Toronto, and like someone who went to Yale, he will not shut up about it. Like, one of those things that he brings up in every conversation. It's like, when I did my PhD at University of Toronto, I'm like, wait, Sean, where did you do your PhD? You haven't told me 700 times since I've known you. But mostly we don't care if someone went to University of Toronto. It's not a big deal, even though he calls it the Harvard of Canada, to which I say, do shut up. No one cares. Now, our resource-limited parents, right, increasingly will choose to have fewer children who secure positions in higher level universities, right, than more children who don't. And basically what they'll do is have fewer children and essentially marshal as many resources as they can to making sure that those children get into elite level schools, right? So tutoring, you know, after school activities, extracurriculars, right? Those that are really, you know, maybe on the cusp of moving into a higher social status will spend an enormous amount of energy trying to get their kids into that higher status category. Because, you know, having a child at an elite university confers more status benefits than just having a child, right? If little Jimmy goes to Harvard, that is better than if, you know, little Jimmy had a brother, is essentially the argument. Okay, so now South Korea. South Korea is a really interesting, and I will say kind of weirdly tragic case in some ways. And honestly, I Googled South Korean school, and this is one of the pictures that came up, right? And it's like 15-hour study in one day, kill me. It's the reason why South Korean students suicide, right? So like I said, didn't look hard for this on Google Images, and this is well known about the Korean education system. It's crazy, right? It's like hours and hours and hours at school because it's super competitive. Okay, so South Korean culture strongly incentivizes increased status, right? It's a really status sensitive culture where your social status really, really matters, right? And you want to make it as high as possible. More so, I think, even than here. Now, to get really high status in South Korean society, really there's a few ways to do it. One is to become like a celebrity and do K-pop, not available to everybody, right? But for the most part, for like the normies, the only high status employers are a really small number of what are called kaiballs. And I know I'm pronouncing this wrong. I'm sorry if you're Korean. You can correct me later. I can never quite pick up the pronunciation of this word. Or chaebols. I can't remember. But whatever. I'm sorry. Don't hate me. But they're basically large horizontally integrated corporations that produce a lot of things and are closely linked to the South Korean government, right? And you probably know them. I mean, at least a measure of you probably have their devices sitting in your pocket, right? Samsung smartphones, but LG, Kia, Hyundai, there's a whole bunch of other ones, but they are the elite places to work if you are in South Korea. If you don't work at one, you're down that ladder socially. Now, the only way to get to work at these corporations is to get into a really good university program in South Korea. And there's not a lot of spots in these programs. They're very limited. And so basically, you have to, your life as a student is spent trying to get the perfect score on the national exam to get into one of these universities and then go work for one of these corporations. And the competition is incredibly fierce, right? And if you read anything or know anything about the South Korean system, right, people going and studying for 15 hours a day is not unusual, right? Students go to school, they go to school for the entire day, and then they're, often taken then to evening tutoring programs where they are tutored by often celebrity tutors, if you can believe that that's a thing. It's a thing in South Korea, right? Who often have corporations who are basically trained to like work with kids to get them these super high scores on the national exam. And apparently, and I've never verified this, but one account that I read said this exam is such a big deal that on the day of this national exam, they basically shut down a lot of the air traffic to create like the perfect conditions, right? It's also one of the days with the highest suicide rate in South Korea because a lot of kids, knowing they're not going to do well, choose to take their own lives instead of actually taking the test. Now, getting a kid, from birth into one of these elite positions is expensive and draining, right? If you're paying, thousands of, dollars, in this case, I don't remember the South Korean currency, but you're paying a big amount of your income to try and get your kid into this program, there's, a couple of choices. Either you have few children, typically one child is the norm, or increasingly, people just forgo having children altogether, right? So 0 children is becoming more normal. And you start to see some really weird things, right? When we talk about low fertility traps, as there are less children around, the society itself becomes less friendly to children, right? And a couple commentators that I've read have noted that what you see increasingly in South Korea is more and more restaurants that are for adults only, right? Where children are simply not allowed. Because, it's not so much the case that, when people have fewer children, they find your children incredibly charming. They apparently find your children incredibly annoying and would rather be free of them, right? And I know I told this anecdote last time, but it had been, someone had an international student from South Korea, and they were off to a baby shower for their sister, and they asked their South Korean friend, well, what do people do in South Korea when someone has a baby? Because they found the baby shower to be kind of an odd tradition. And they're like, I don't know, nobody I know has a child, so I've never, really seen what happens, right? This is a sort of low fertility trap. The whole society gets more and more geared for childless people, and it becomes less and less friendly. And honestly, like at this 0.68 fertility, in 50 years, you're going to see a probably roughly 60%, sorry, that's a percent, a very bad one, reduction in South Korea's population, right? At that low fertility, without immigration, populations crash. And they crash really, really fast. So, does South Korea have a future? I don't know. Okay, that's It always takes me longer. I thought it was like, I'm doing great. Now I'm like, I'm doing terrible. All right, this one's quick. Status secure people, established elites, tend to have higher fertility. Well, in America, right, the ultra rich, families with an average income over $1 million a year, are probably our most status secure, right? That's a lot of money, more or less. They're the only demographic of American society that has replacement fertility, right? At a replacement fertility of just over replacement, 2.15. From 1 million to 500,000, it drops to 1.85. So these are still fairly status secure, but they're not the ultra wealthy, right? $500,000 of family income in the US is quite a bit, at least in most places. And still there, it's not super high. It's still above the American average, but it's lower than what you might expect, given that at, just under 1 million to 500,000, you could probably afford, more infants, more children, but people still tend not to. And the explanation that Kurtz gives is that they are still attempting to climb that social ladder. Okay, so I can probably do this in a few minutes. Okay, so there's basically, if we want to talk status types or status games, right? Ways that you potentially could increase your status. Well, the obvious one is dominance, right? And historically, dominance has been an important one. You coerce people, by force or fear to do what you want, right? You're the best warrior, or you're the strongest, chieftain, or whatever it happens to be, right? You're a warlord, right? You can increase your status through coercion and fear, right? Or you're a Mexican cartel drug lord, right? Not an occupation that you might want to be in right this moment, but generally, right, how do these people increase their status, right, or organized crime bosses? Well, it's through coercion and fear. Okay. Historically, another way has been through virtue, right? You could increase your status by, being conspicuously dutiful, right? Following the rules, being obedient, and being very moralistic, right? Really strict on moral rules, and therefore being seen as, like, say, a pillar of your community. Or the third one, right? So this is 1, 2, 3, is by success, right? Where your achievements, you increase your status by achieving very specified outcomes, right? Career milestones, degrees, these sorts of things, right? Publications, being named one of the top 40 under 40 in Edmonton, in terms of business leaders, or something like that, right? Achievements, hitting a wealth goal, buying a fancy house, right? Those kinds of things. So what Kurtz says, and again, I think this is correct, in the pre-Enlightenment era, right? So before the Enlightenment, before industrialization, women, basically derived their status in a couple of ways. One of them was by social class, right? So by birth, right? So if you were born into a higher social class, you immediately were given status. You could marry up in social class to increase your status, obviously within limits, or by virtue, right? And mostly this was conferred by, virtue was conferred by the church, but things like, virginity, piety, and motherhood, right, were things that women could do to increase status, right? So status was mostly, historically, in periods of high fertility, derived from, virtue or dominance games. And what Kurtz says is neither one of these is in competition with fertility, right? Since motherhood and, piety were both part of the status games that women used to play, and things that conferred them status. But what he says is the Enlightenment, and then later kind of articulations of Enlightenment philosophy, specifically things like feminism, shifted that And increasing, though it happens before feminism, increasingly everything shifted to a meritocracy, right? So it's not for nothing that after the Enlightenment, we see the breakdown of class as an important social category, right? People don't tend to think of class as important, right? And just being born to a certain social class doesn't really confer you the same status as it used to. I know I'm almost done. I know you have to go. But increasingly, it's what you achieve, right? Your education, how much money you make, the career you build, and all of those things. So it's shifted, where we get status to success, but success is competitive with fertility because, the more kids you have, the more trade-offs you have to do, especially if you're a woman, with having children, right? So the children, you're going to lose time in your career and all that fun stuff. And I'm sorry I've gone a minute over. We'll see you on Friday. I think we're almost done. Wow, I hadn't seen a question slide in a while. I will answer these on Friday.
Do you believe in ghosts?
Do I believe in ghosts?
Yeah.
I do not believe in ghosts.
I developed a theory that has to do with replacement therapy for ghosts, and that would be psychology aspects of it.
A fair trade-off. Hello.
I just want to when I could discuss